Here with Grace Ji-Sung Kim and Graham Hill, interviewing them about their book, Healing Our Broken Humanity. Now, as you can see, my copy is well loved and a bit battered. So there were two sections that I particularly really loved. So I'm going to ask you some questions about that later. But for now, tell me what led you to write this book and how you came to be co-authors.
So Graham and I met each other around 2015. He was doing a world tour, filming theologians and other scholars around the world. So that's when we met, and we kind of asked ourselves, what can we work on together in the future? And that's how we got into this book. So yeah, within 4 years, we got a book out from the time we met. Yeah.
And we were talking about, as we look at Christianity around the globe and some of the lessons that are emerging from what God is doing around the globe, what are some practical ways that churches can put those things into practice in order to renew the church and to heal a broken humanity and to positively impact society? And we decided it'd be good to do that together, and there's something nice about writing something together from very different perspectives. So a woman and a man from different ethnicities, different cultural backgrounds, coming from with different stories and experiences writing together.
Different countries. So yeah, that made a difference. And I think that kind of enriched it. And I'm hoping that others can follow what we're doing, that it's nice to have one voice, but to have two voices in a book on the same topic, I think it enriched the whole book.
I'm wondering, because you're talking about healing our broken humanity, did you find writing together healing? Because you're definitely writing across difference. Was there anything that was broken that needed healing? Is there something that kind of, I guess, mirrored the process, so content mirroring form?
That's a very good question. I mean, for me personally, as I began to write this book and then listen to Grace's experience, it made me reflect on the history of colonisation, the history of racism and sexism. As I listened to Grace share some of her stories, I became more aware of what that meant for her and for many Asian Americans and Asian Australians and people of minoritised groups. My personal experience was reflecting on my own unexamined racisms and the way in which my maleness and my whiteness and the history of the peoples that I'd come from had impacted minoritised groups. So there's that broader reflection, but also a personal reflection. The more I thought about this, and I do talk about this on the book, the more I thought about my own racisms. And the fact that every now and then, as I would listen to Grace's story, and I realised with horror sometimes that I hadn't understood the experience of minoritised people and Grace's experience, my own sort of unexamined sexism and racism, which I needed to give to Christ and needed to be healed from and challenged about, and Grace helped me do that.
Yeah, and just to continue on what he's saying, it was really nice because, living in the U.S., people are aware of racism and white privilege, white supremacy, and you can have a discussion with a white person, but many times I feel like nobody gets it. But Graham was able to kind of own it and share it in the book, which was, I think, it just brought a new perspective and a new respect for Graham, that he is able to see it and kind of name it and talk about it from his perspective in the book. So I think that's what made the book so rich. I can share my experiences and he can share his experiences from total different perspectives and different experiences. And so the white people, and particularly the white men, can read it and say, oh, maybe I didn't see it that way, but Graham is showing us the way we can kind of view this problem and this brokenness in the world, and vice versa with me. So that's really hard to find. Even, very progressive people, sometimes they don't get it and it's frustrating, but Graham was able to get it and name it and share it. And so that, I think, just the pairing of it, which I didn't expect when we first started the book. I didn't know, you have an idea and you think where it's going to go, but it was a deeper kind of sense of journey, and I think the result was even richer. So we're hoping as readers read it, they'll appreciate the different perspectives and how we kind of share brokenness from different worlds and different sides.
Yeah, I think both of you, who you are as individuals, so separate from your scholarly lives, so obviously your scholarly rigor and your practice comes through in the book, but one of the things I really appreciated is how much of your personal life shines through and who you are as people, and you really brought who you genuinely are to this book, and I think that's really key. It's something that's about humanity, is that you need to be vulnerable in yourselves, and I love that. And so you really do talk from your own perspectives. And so I'm wondering how that plays out for an Australian audience and for an American audience. How do you see the book being really practical in those two different, similar but different settings?
Yeah. So, I was born in Korea, raised in Canada, and then now I teach in the U.S. I think that the trans kind of migration has brought a different perspective. But wherever you go, whether, this is my first time in Australia, whether you live in Australia, United States, Africa, we kind of do experience the same types of brokenness, but not to the same level or the exact same experience, but the experience of colonialism, of racism, sexism, and all these different kind of experiences, my experiences and Graham's experience, I think you do experience it. So even though Graham's writing it from an Australian and I'm writing it from an immigrant, kind of Asian North American, I think the topics in the book are relatable, that wherever you live, we do experience or we participate in this sin and the brokenness. So we're hoping to address it in that way.
And it is true that some of the issues take slightly different forms in the different contexts. So I think about justice issues around asylum seekers and refugees, the disadvantage that women face in Australia. And I know you're involved in issues around domestic and family violence in Australia, and when I think about the experience of minoritised groups and the experience of our Aboriginal peoples, I think there's so much injustice and so much of it mirrors, but it takes slightly different histories and forms than that in the US. At times in Australia, I feel we may not be as cognizant about some of the issues as some of the conversations have evolved in the US. But at the same time, more and more I'm hoping that people in the Australian context will have similar kinds of conversations that are happening around the US about addressing the injustices and the systemic racism and sexism that occurs in our society. So we are coming from very different perspectives, but our nations have in some ways some similarities in terms of their histories.
And just to piggyback on that and your work with domestic violence and violence against women, that occurs not just in Australia, in the US, it occurs in all nations where women are victims of abuse, physical, mental, psychological, and spiritual abuse. So, we can't, in the book, we try to address as much as we can, but, the list will go on and on and on, and the publisher said you have to narrow it. But just to broadly speak about the gender injustice, the racial injustice. Also, we touched a little bit on climate injustice. These happen in different contexts and different degrees and different ways. But I think the book will get people to rethink and start the conversation amongst their family or their friends and churches. And I know churches are already using it. So I'm really hopeful that church groups and study groups will continue to use it, because these experiences kind of happen, and it's sad that the brokenness is happening and occurring different ways against women and women of color. But that's something that needs to continue to be addressed, and particularly in the churches.
Thank you for that. Oh, wow. Yeah, so what I found particularly helpful in my line of work, working with victims and survivors of domestic and family violence, was your section on reinforcing agency. So often women have had their agency taken away from them. So they've lost their autonomy, their liberty, their equality. So I found your section on reinforcing agency was really relevant to my work. But you've actually outlined 9 different practices, and so I'm hoping you can tell me a little bit more about the rationale behind that.
The practices evolved in conversation. For me, the practices which I contributed came out of listening to voices from all over the globe and listening to their concerns and observing the way in which Christ and His Spirit is renewing the church. So noticing themes around justice and hospitality and reconciliation and agency and then contributing, saying to Grace, I think some of these might be the practices that I'd like to see us addressing, and Grace brought her own practices and we talked that through. I mean, one of the reasons I think we write well together is because we listen to each other and we defer to each other, and there's that kind of relationship's not easy to find, and it makes, we don't argue about semicolons and things.
Or periods or commas.
Yeah, so that works really well. But more broadly, on the agency question, I've come to the core conviction that as a white, privileged, educated male, the best thing I can do in life is take a listening and learning and attentive posture, and to assume I don't understand. And the best thing I can do is be quiet and listen. And I think that I've carried that, and we've enjoyed that in our writing relationship. And I think it's shaped the practices too, because it's about us listening to what God is doing and what's important to others, particularly the minoritized church. And in terms of agency, the question that sort of really sits heavily on me is, for too long people like me have spoken for others, or we've spoken and silenced others. So we're either silencing others or we're speaking for others. And none of those are good things. So what does it mean today to be silent and to listen closely and to provide opportunities for others to have agency, to have a voice, to be heard, to be noticed, and to relinquish power and control and pay whatever price needs to be paid for the sake of others.
Yeah.
And so this is where...
So Erin, thank you for bringing up agency, because as a feminist theologian, that's been a very important part of my journey. And I forget how we put it in the book, but I'm so glad we ended up putting it in the book, because feminist theologians, yes, we want to give women agency, give voice. We are tired, when I look at church history and church theology for the past 2,000 years, men have spoken for us, men have told us what we needed to know and learn and need to do. So we need to have this power back and give that agency to other powerless people, particularly women. But when we think about the gender issue, the sexuality issue, the marginal people, the marginalized people in our society. Australia and America, land of immigrants. How are we treating those who come in as climate refugees, political refugees, religious refugees? So giving them agency, I think, is so important. So I think all the practices that we came up with, I think could have been longer. I think that's what we did in another book, but you can only do so much in one particular book. They really it perks people's curiosity and new ways of thinking for people, wherever you live, Australia or the US, that people will be challenged. People will want to follow some of these practices. I think one of them, particularly Lament. So far when I've been speaking or talking about the book, either in the church or colleges and seminaries, most people are very intrigued by the question of lament, how we do it. Crying out to God. We don't do that enough in our pain and sorrow. And so that's a practice that's been lost in the church. We don't do that on a Sunday morning worship. We do have the repentance part, but we don't really do the lamenting. So maybe that's something that we need to do more, because that's one that many people have been interested in.
So firstly, please do write another book. Secondly, I think the way, even just in this interview, you two model listening to one another and respect and mutuality is, I think that also reflects your book. And that's a really beautiful thing, listening to one another and allowing the other to speak and raising the voice of the other. And I hope that this book encourages other people to do so, and to give agency and voice to people who might not have it. But so that does lead me to ask, because you've touched on agency and lament, which are the two areas that really spoke to me in the book. What do you think our churches do well? Because I think you're right. I think we don't do lament particularly well. So what are we doing well? What's encouraging? And what else perhaps do you think we can improve on?
Well, I know one for the Korean American churches, Korean Canadian churches, and churches in Asia. One thing we do better than other maybe non-Korean or non-Asian churches are, I think we're good at hospitality. Usually after church, although your church, Thornley, practices hospitality. In the white churches, I rarely see that in the U.S. So, but Korean churches, we love to eat. We center a lot of things around eating and getting together and drinking and having tea, coffee. So I think that is a way to kind of open your arms and open your hearts to the strangers and new people in your community and the churches. We love to share food together. So that, I think, is one good thing. So in a Korean church on a Sunday after church, there's always some meal. It'll be probably rice and soup and something, but there's 99% of our churches will have a meal. So we love to just sit there and eat together, because that's a form of hospitality, welcoming the newcomers into the church. So that's one thing that I think we're good at. I don't know about
And I think we do certain forms of hospitality really well, such eating together and so on. But hospitality is a very broad concept and very challenging when you start to dig deeply into what it means. Because I think, God is into bending, breaking, redefining borders and boundaries. And we as Christians often like hospitality when it's with people who are like us. Mm-hmm. People who look like us, people who speak our language, people who share our political views and values. But actually hospitality is much more prophetic and profound than that. And it's about our relationship to the land, to those who are not like us, who don't look like us, who don't speak our language, who don't share our religion, who see the world differently. And when you start to dig deeply into what hospitality is about, it takes a lot of courage and deep commitment to others and to Christ, to love God, to love the stranger, and to love the enemy. Recently I was listening to someone talk about how the measure of loving God is to love the neighbour, and the measure of loving the neighbour is love of the stranger, and the measure of love of stranger is love of enemy. So you can't love God unless you love neighbour, stranger, and enemy. And actually a lot of this is about hospitality. So I think in Australia, and it might be true in America as well, we do need to continue being good at the kind of hospitality we show. And the times I've been in the US, I find Americans very hospitable people. But we need to think more about how does hospitality reshape and break and redefine a lot of the boundaries and barriers and divisions that we see in the world today.
Well, I mean, I'm sitting here personally convicted, wanting to invite more people into my home now, let alone my church. So I guess that leads me to ask, so I think that would be a hope for me, is that more of us are more welcoming and I think in a broader and possibly systemic kind of way rather than personally being welcoming or hospitable. Is that a hope that you have that this book might help people achieve? And then I guess my bigger question is, what's your biggest dream or your biggest hope for this book?
Well, of course, we want people to read it and be transformed, be revitalized, change their ways of being. So working towards a healing. So if they can practice a bit more hospitality, practice the lamenting, the reconciliation, which is also, these are all not easy things. It's one thing to talk about it, write about it, but to live it out is very difficult. One of my previous books is called Embracing the Other, and it is really hard to kind of reach out to the stranger and the enemy and embrace them. But Christ showed us how to do it. It's just we kind of sometimes refuse and we become lazy. We don't want to do it. We don't want to participate in it because we like to maintain the status quo. Americans love to maintain the status quo. So just keep the women, under us, and the refugees, don't give them anything, So we love the status quo, but, Christ came to overturn the status quo. That's what he did with all of his ministry, reaching out to the Samaritan woman and healing the lepers and being with the lepers. So we need to rethink how we are living our lives and our ways of being and work towards our personal healing, our church healing, the community healings. We're hoping that churches and people will be transformed by reading the book.
And so we believe that love and justice, reconciliation and embrace are healing practices. And our hope is that as churches embrace these practices, that they would bring healing to individuals, to families, to neighbourhoods, to the church, and more broadly to the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and every book has a life of its own. So, people are appreciating the content, and people are using it in the churches. And I'm glad the Australians are, and Americans and Canadians are. So, hopefully, it may be translated to different languages so that other people around the world.
That would be amazing.
Yes. Because that's what we had envisioned, that people around the world, and you just need a few people to kind of change their ways, and it gets contagious. Our life is so short. Why are we spending so much time destroying and hating and building walls when you can build bridges and extend hand and welcome and practice hospitality?
Well, thank you both very much for such considered and considerate and thoughtful and I think genuinely really beautiful answers. It was a real privilege to interview you both today.
Thank you so much for doing it from that perspective of your work with women and domestic violence. Thank you.
You're very welcome. So yes, if you haven't had a chance to grab a copy yet, make sure you read Healing Our Broken Humanity. It's been really beneficial for me personally and in my teaching and in my church community. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.